Welcome to episode number 61 of 100 Plus, an overview of 100 of the most important people, events, and ideas of the last 2,000 years. This is a survey of the forces and factors that have shaped today's world, Western civilization, the Christian faith, and you. Our hope is that by tracing the path that led us to this moment, we will not only better understand this moment, what is going on and why, but also that we'll be able to live more thoughtfully and faithfully as Christ followers. Today's topic focuses us on global missions in the 18th century with a particular focus on William Carey. As you will soon see, he's a pivotal figure in the missional expansion of the church, which contributes in various ways to the expansion of Western civilization around the globe. Most people today live with a dated view of the world. That is, their understanding of what is going on, what is actually happening, is days, weeks, months, sometimes years behind what is actually going on. When I was a management consultant, I would often start by making this point, and I would make the point by asking people a set of questions, such as, what was the most popular baby name in London last year? People seldom got it right. The answer was Muhammad. Their view of how many people were single versus how many people were married was also years behind. They were living in a world that was not the world that they were actually living in. So all of this to set up and say their view, and dare I say, your view, my view of the church was also dated. For instance, many today think of the church as being a fairly Western-centric movement. That is not true and hasn't been for decades. About 40 years ago, the center of gravity of the church moved to the south and to the east. To put numbers on this, in 1800, 1% of the Christians in the world were found in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In 1900, 10% of Christians were found in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In 1960, 42% of Christians were found in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And by 1980, the number had grown to 15%, and by 1998, it was 70%, and it has continued to climb. The church today is no longer primarily European or American, it's global. And there are two big ands here. The Christian community outside of the West is what is growing. The church in Africa is growing 2.5 times faster than the continental population. The church in Latin America is growing 3 times faster than the general population. The church in China has exploded from around 1 million Christians in 1949 when the missionaries were kicked out to, by some estimates, 50 million today. I've heard numbers as low as 30 million. I've heard numbers as high as 100 million. But the fact of the matter is, on any given Sunday, pre-COVID, it is believed that there were more people worshiping Christ in China than there were in the United States. And as if that isn't enough, there is another big surprise. The churches in the emerging world are sending out more missionaries than the churches in the West are. At some point in the late 1990s, the churches in the emerging world, or the majority world, whatever term you want to use for Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the former Soviet bloc countries, those churches began sending out more missionaries than the churches in the West. The Korean church, which has about 12 million people, has been sending out thousands of missionaries over the last several decades. And I read at one point that 1 million South Koreans stand ready to take the gospel into North Korea if the border is ever opened. The church in Cuba is sending out missionaries to Haiti. There are now missionaries from the emerging world, majority world, whatever, planting churches in the United States. Some of the largest churches in North America are churches that are being planted by Nigerian pastors. So look, there are Chinese missionaries in Cambodia, there are Filipino missionaries in Indonesia, there are Cuban missionaries in Haiti. It's just very different than many people think. So things are changing. Of course, they've always been changing, and over the last 2,000 years, the church has always been growing. Christianity started very small. There were not that many people in the upper room waiting for something to happen when the Holy Spirit descends upon them, reported in Acts chapter 2. But the church did not stay small. I mean, instantly, they spilled out into the streets. They were speaking, of course, in foreign languages and strange tongues, and several thousand people that day gave their life to Christ. So the church has been on the march from that very beginning in Acts chapter 2 to today, where there's somewhere between 1.5 billion and 2 billion Christians in the world. It depends upon your definition of a Christian, depends upon what study you're seeing. But the church has become not only the oldest institution in the world, but it is the largest, and it is the most ethnically diverse, and it is the most geographically dispersed organization in the history of the world. And all of that is the story of missions. So in today's episode, I want to try and bring all of that into clearer focus. So to that end, we'll briefly consider the biblical mandate that we find in the Bible for missions, then review the growth of the church, starting at the end of the book of Acts up through today, and then when we get to the 18th century, which is where we're at in our chronological study, we're going to look at William Carey. He's sort of a point person for what was happening in the 18th century. He was a cobbler. I remember looking at a picture of William Carey at Fuller Seminary in their School of World Missions. There's a big picture of Carey, and he's at a cobbler's bench. And I was initially confused, like, why that picture? And I was reminded that he was a cobbler before he became a missionary to India, before he wrote a book that sort of sets him up as the father of modern day missions. So he is not alone, by the way. There are other people we could look at. David Livingston, you might remember the line, Dr. Livingston, I presume. Dr. Livingston was a Scottish physician. He was a big explorer. He's a rags to riches guy. He was a big anti-slavery crusader. He was sort of a legend during his own life, a mythical hero, because he went out to try and find the basis, the starting point, the source of the Nile. And during this time that he's doing this, most Europeans that go to Africa would be dead within months. They just were not prepared for all the tropical diseases that they were going to face in the bush. He continued. He lived for years and years and years. I think he spent something like 30 years. I just ordered a book on Dr. Livingston. He was trying to find the source of the Nile because he wanted the fame that would come with it. And then from the fame, he was going to use his fame to try and put an end to East African, Arab, Swahili slave trade. So anyway, David Livingston is a missionary. He's an explorer. He's more than simply understood to be a missionary, but he is a missionary. You also have Hudson Taylor, famous for his work in China. When I was right out of grad school, just starting as a pastor, there was a retired missionary couple from China living in town. And they were, to my way of thinking, older than old, probably not as old as I am now, but I thought they were like, wow, were they old. They had been, and they probably were actually in their 70s. I'm 60, so, but they had been missionaries in China through, at the time, it was called China Inland Missions. It had changed its name. It has subsequently changed its name to Overseas Missionary Fellowship. So there was a period in sort of mission development where all the missionaries would go to just the borders. So they were working along the borders of China and the borders in Africa. And then there became this new phase where the mission agencies were sending people into the interior. And so when Hudson Taylor starts China Inland Mission, it's all about going into the interior, and that was new. Hudson Taylor's sort of a legendary guy. He went when he was quite young, and he was a Marine's Marine in terms of his work ethic, in terms of his sort of daring, and the stories that this couple had were full of like, oh my goodness, I can't believe how challenging your life is, how challenging your life was. But that was sort of the ethos of Overseas Missionary Fellowship. Taylor had sailed to China in 1853 as a 21-year-old. So he's falling outside of our 18th century. He's a 19th century guy, but he had gone as a 21-year-old, and he had already been working hard to learn Mandarin and study medicine in addition to the Bible. There were very few missionaries there at the time. He becomes controversial right away because he adopts a more contextualized approach. So there's a scale that you talk about in terms of how contextual your work is going to be. I don't remember the scale. I think it's like C1 to C5. C1 is you're going to look like, if you're from Chicago, you're going to go and look like you're from Chicago and wear your Chicago Cubs hat and talk like you're from Chicago, and you're going to introduce the songs that are popular, the worship songs that are popular in Chicago, all of that. This is sort of this is the way missionaries in the West get caricaturized, I should say. And it's not really what a lot of people were doing. But there was a season where there was more of that done than certainly now, where you can be very contextual. I think C5 is you sort of look like, completely adopt all the customs. It's hard to figure out that you were ever a Westerner. And in some cases, I remember talking with a guy that was going to a country, he wouldn't tell me where. He had grown up in a Muslim country, and he was all about attending mosque on Fridays and arguing out of the Quran for Jesus. And so it's a very contextualized approach. Anyway, Hudson Taylor gets sideways with the other missionaries because he adopts Chinese garb. He grows a ponytail, pigtail, I think they called it. And he was very much about going to the interior. And so he is going to work really, really hard. He's going to have a hard life. 4 of his children die. His first wife dies. But he will, by the time that he's done, there will be a couple thousand people with his mission agency in China. So there's other people besides William Carey that we could look at. There's other movements like the Student Haystack prayer meeting, which happens just at the beginning of the 19th century. But there was Samuel Mills and a number of students begin to pray for foreign missions. So at this point, all the missions has been going on through the 1700s has been, it's been to the Native Americans, it's been into Indian communities, it's been out west to unsettled areas. So you were sending missionaries there. Samuel Mills and some other college students are out praying for foreign missions, and somehow they get caught in a thunderstorm and they hide in a haystack. I'm not really sure. I'm too much of I can't say a country boy, can't say a city boy, suburban. I've had too much of a suburban life to understand how you hide in a haystack or under a haystack, but that's what they did. And out of this meeting, out of this prayer meeting, comes lots more prayer meetings, and then they sort of launch out of this. You've got the student volunteer movement. You've got all these students that are signing up to be missionaries and to take the gospel overseas. So there's other people we could look at, but we're gonna do our broad overview. So 2 things before we look to Acts 29. If you know your Bible, you know there is no Acts 29, the book of Acts. It sort of famously sort of stops at Acts 28. It doesn't really end. It doesn't seem to have a conclusion to it. And so there is a mission planting movement called Acts 29, suggesting that we're all writing our own chapter. So we're going to pick up in Acts, at the end of Acts 28. Before we do that, let me note two things. One, there is a trajectory from really Genesis 3 throughout the Bible in which you are seeing that God is, Genesis 1 is obviously creation, Genesis 3 is the fall, but it's the promise of the gospel, and then Genesis 12, the call of Abraham, and this idea that God is going to bless Abraham and his descendants, the Jews, so that they will be a blessing to all the people, all the nations. And so there's this outward thrust to the biblical story. And there are places where this is particularly pronounced. And so, for instance, the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28. So towards the very end of Christ's 40 days after his resurrection, just before his ascension, sort of the last things that he's saying is particularly important because they're among the last things that Jesus says to his disciples. He says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey all that I have commanded, and I will be with you always, even to the end of the age." And so we've got this commissioning of his followers to go everywhere. Earlier in Matthew 24, the disciples have asked Jesus, what will be the sign, of your return and the coming kingdom? And he says certain things will be happening, there will be certain signs, but then he says, before I return, the gospel will be taken to all the nations. And then this all the nations, it's a particular passage, it's a particular phrase in the Greek, and I should know it, Pante al ethne. Boy, am I butchering that. But anyway, it is the word ethne had been translated nations, and then at the Lausanne Conference in 1974, Ralph Winter and others said, we've got to look at this word ethne and look at it more as an ethnic group, people group, language group. And so there was this understanding that had to reach all the different tribes and people groups, not just to think of nations. Of course, in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, you have Jesus saying, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world." So Jerusalem is obviously where they were at. Judea is sort of the county. Samaria is not like the state. Samaria is the area that the Jews didn't want to go. But so Jesus is saying, look, this is the trajectory. This is going to go out. And there's, again, other commands that we find in Scripture. In Genesis 1, we've got the cultural mandate that we're to be stewards of the earth. In Mark chapter 12, we have the great, not the Great Commission, but the Great Commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so there's an aspect that the mission of the church is driven by taking the gospel and the news of Jesus to everybody, and by loving and serving them. And different topic, but I have noted that the church has got these two assignments. We are to proclaim the good news and engage in good works. We talk about them in that order because while lots of other people can be involved in good works, only a Christian is going to help you proclaim the good news. Christians are the only ones talking about Christ and an empty tomb and a risen Savior. And there's a sense in which what Jesus is calling us to, it's not that it's spiritual as opposed to physical, but it's eternal as opposed to temporal. So we put them in that order, but we understand the church gets commissioned by Jesus to take the message of Christ as the Savior of the world and to bring the kingdom values, loving and caring for people. And so there's this outward trajectory that we see in the Gospels. The second thing to understand before we start looking at the outward trajectory is there is an interplay between the spread of the church and the spread of Western civilization. And this is really hard to tease apart. There are reasons for outward expansion for countries. Countries want to expand this period of colonialism, which is, of course, is controversial, but Spain and the Dutch and then the English and others the French are going to be engaged in colonialism. Part of it was just prestige, right, to expand the size of your country. Part of it was because it was so easy at a certain period of time. The difference between the West in terms of having had the scientific revolution and all the technological advances, when you compared their ability to simply dominate in any kind of battle, once you've got gunpowder, which of course comes out of China, but once you've got weapons, you're so much stronger than these undeveloped areas that it was easy for this expansion to take place. A third thing, the countries for a while were doing a lot of expansion because they saw it as a way to get rich. It turns out, upon further review, most of these colonial powers actually sort of were paying more for their colonies than they were extracting from it. But you had countries that were expanding, and as the countries would expand, right, a lot of the people on these ships were missionaries. Like, they're going from Spain as Spaniards, or sometimes they're going as priests and monks of the church, and sometimes it's not really clear, but they're planting a Spanish flag. So you've got people that are expanding on the basis of that. You've got businesses that are expanding because they do see this as an opportunity to increase their market share, to get goods and services from there and sell them back in Europe, or to sell goods to other communities. And then you also have the expansion that's being driven by Christians who are acting out of a sense of obedience to the Great Commission, obedience to God, and out of a sense of love and out of a sense of charity. So it's complicated when we're looking at the expansion of Western civilization and the expansion of the church. And of course, there's lots of things that are going to go wrong in this expansion, especially as we bring 21st century standards to bear. But I just mentioned this. In 1800s, Europeans controlled 35% of the land surface of the globe. By 1878, they controlled 67%, and over the next couple decades, leading up to World War I, by 1914, Europeans dominated 84% of the world's land area. The British Empire alone had 25% of the Earth's inhabitants under the flag. So everywhere Europe went, Western civilization went, and alongside of it, sometimes out in front of it, sometimes a bit behind it, mostly in front, was the church. Okay, so with that, let's back up and begin with Acts chapter 29. Looking at what happens from the end of the book of Acts, which is where we started, up to today. I mean, there's different ways that this story is told. We've been following mostly a chronological path, and that is, we've been doing that over, dear listener, we've been doing that over 59 episodes. And so we started, book of Acts is ending. Peter and Paul are still alive, best we can tell. Nero is going to likely be the instigator of the fire. He's certainly going to blame the Christians for it. And so that was, I think, the first episode. And the second one was then looking at the fall of Jerusalem to the Romans. And then we sort of marched through following the church, and we're looking at some of the early days, and we're looking at the ante-Nicene church fathers, so before the council of Constantinople, before the rise of Constantine. We're looking at what's happening in the church, and then we trace it through all the things that we have been through. The fall of Rome and the rise of some of the other church leaders like Augustine and Jerome, and we've looked at the rise of Charlemagne and the Great Schism, and we've looked at the rise of the popes. We've looked at early reformers like Wycliffe and Huss. We then looked at the Renaissance, and then we looked at the reformers, Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, and then the Counter-Reformation with the Catholics, and then on into the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution and all of those things. Most recently, we have jumped the pond. We've been spending a little bit more time on America. We've looked at the Revolution, contrasting the American and French Revolution, looked at the Great Awakening, capitalism, Romanticism, been looking at all these things. So we've sort of been marching forward chronologically. Some people, when they're looking at the church, they're just much more geographically limited, and they look at what happens there, sort of independent. We've really been focusing on the West, so Europe and the United States. Some people just really drill down on key players. So I've done a little bit of this. I am aware that most people find personal stories, like the story of St. Patrick or the story of William Carey or the story of other people, Augustine, to be more interesting than the development of ideas. I'm in that weird little subset that says, I love the stories, I love the biographies, love to read historical biographies and autobiographies, but I'm just very vexed by how the ideas and cultures develop and move around. So some people just are all about the history of ideas. Some people will look at the church and just trace it through their denomination. We're sort of doing a smattering, but limited mostly around the West. And so we're drilling down now on William Carey. So the church has expanded up through this time, through all the things that we have noted, but missionary activity has not been driven much outside of colonial work. So we now come upon the father of modern missions. He's born in 1761 to a relatively poor family in England. Northamptonshire. His father initially worked on a loom in a fabric shop, and then he became a church secretary and then a schoolmaster, but he didn't have much money, and so William, his son, does not get to go to school after the age of 12. He learns a trade, and again, as I said, his trade is as a cobbler, so he makes shoes. While he is working in his apprenticeship and learning to make shoes, he rubs shoulders with a dissenter. So remember, the dissenters are those who do not go along with the state church. So in this case, the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And so this particular guy was part of the Congregationalists. He was a particular Baptist. That's the name of the group. The word, the modifier there, particular, is used to refer to their understanding of the application of redemption. So did Christ's death on the cross cover all the sins of the world? Only the people that were elect? I mean, how is that to be understood? And so basically, particular Baptists were Calvinists following remember the tulip that we talked about, total depravity, irresistible grace, limited atonement, total depravity, unconditional election, limited grace, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. So this is the limits of the atonement. There was a particular Baptist, And so Carey is going to switch. He's going to leave the Church of England, and he is going to become a low church Calvinist. And then he is going to become a pastor, a preacher. He's going to serve a couple churches, one in England, in Moulton, England, and then one in Leicester. And while he is serving at the church in Leicester, he writes a booklet. And he's going to be called the father of modern day missions, both because of his life, because he's going to leave church in England there and head out and go to the mission field in India, but also because he writes a book, this booklet, which in a great 18th century way has got the wonderful title of An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathen, in which the religious state of different nations of the world, the success of former undertakings, and the practicability of further undertakings are considered. That's the kind of titles you get with books in the 18th century. So he writes this booklet, and he sort of notes the history of missionary activity, starting with the apostles, moving through the patristic period, moving through the medieval period, through the Reformation, and he ends saying, time for us to get going. And he had 5 things that he was advocating. First, preach the gospel widely using all appropriate methods. Secondly, support preaching by translating and distributing the Bible in the common language. Third, establish a local church as soon as possible. Fourth, study the culture and language of the people you are sharing the gospel with. And 5, make the training of indigenous leaders a priority. So as quickly as you can, find out a way to turn leadership over to the people. So this formulation is widely shared and embraced and adopted in the early 19th century, and it becomes sort of the model, the template of modern missions. So let me note, nothing about missions is easy, and it was even harder back then. The first challenge he faced in going to India was that he wasn't allowed to go to India. India was controlled by various, colonial powers and cities. The British did not rule India directly. They ruled it through this East India Company and East India Trade Company, which had an incredible amount of power, and it did not allow missionaries. And so he's going to have some dust-ups in which he tries to stay under the radar, eventually gets identified, and that's a challenge. So he ends up needing to head to a different city. He's going to be in Serampore as opposed to where he was initially headed, which was Calcutta. Once he's there, he needs to learn the language. So he works for 6 years he's working for 6 years overseeing a farm. And while he's doing this, he is going to work on the language and also just on supporting his family. So you can read his diary. It's full of very exciting entries, like January 31st, where he writes, "A day of vexation and barrenness. It was worse than nothing." February 7th, he had but little pleasure, though much leisure. It's been a day of lassitudes, I guess, and dullness. So for 6 years, he manages this plantation, which gave him time to learn the Bengali language. And then after 6 years, in 1800, he moved back to Serampore. There he becomes a professor of Bengali at a new British government-backed school, Fort William College. He bought a big house, and he begins to attract some others that are going to be involved in this missionary enterprise. His job as a professor of the language at this British school provided him with enough money, and he had time to travel, and he spends a lot of time trying to start a church, sharing the gospel with people and starting a church. And in 1818, he and other missionaries will found their own college, Serampore College, and also will found a missionary press, and he will spend the rest of his life. He dies in 1834 at the age of 72. He'll spend the rest of his life working through this college and through this printing press. So again, there's a lot of things that could be said about his life. If you've not read any missionary biographies, you're really missing out. It is their lives. Everything you do in this life, right? What's the line about Ginger Rogers? Everything that Fred Astaire did, she did backwards and in high heels. So everything that a missionary is going to do, starting a business, starting a school, starting a church, living life, you're doing in another culture, without your friendship base, without much money, in a different language. And so they will see success. He is very frustrated at how little success they see, but it is estimated that 500 people had come to faith by 1813, and by 1832, 1,266 people had come to faith. They had also been working on translating the Bible into 40 different languages, and that they had planted, under his leadership, they had planted 100 schools. So missionary activity always was, especially still today, is very, very challenging. But let me pivot here now and say one of the biggest challenges is that it's often undermined by people today who consider it just a form of colonialism, and there's just a lot of criticism of missionary work. Some contend that the conversion of local people is itself colonialism. Some say that regardless of individual conversions, the dominating country uses missionaries to help make locals docile and submissive, and to legitimate the colonial power as if it was sent from God. Some claim that missionaries spread both Christianity and also Western culture, or perhaps white social culture, because it's virtually impossible for the missionaries to separate these two. Finally, some critics would say that the missionaries often prioritize the people's spiritual need over their material and physical needs. So, Christians have and continue to push back on some of this. At the end of the day, we would not say that sharing the gospel is a form of colonialism, but the other challenges, the other things that were listed, I think we have to take a look at on a case-by-case basis. So in his book, How the West Won, Rodney Stark, a historian, writes, quote, "Nearly all modern accounts of missions stress greed and racism as the basis for Europe's colonial expansion. Granted, both were significant factors, but so were idealism and charity, especially on the part of Christian missionaries, who were often at least as concerned to educate and modernize foreign lands as to convert the world to Christ." So he goes on to note that by 1910, British and American overseas mission organizations had established 86 colleges and 522 teachers' colleges and thousands of elementary schools in Asia and Africa. And he also notes that during the 19th century, in 1840 alone, the British Navy intercepted 425 slave ships off the west coast of Africa, hanged the slavers, returned the slaves to Sierra Leone, and set them free. So, look, history is full of bullies and saints. And so that's what we're going to get. I don't think we have to do much to defend the missionary strategies from the 1700s as if they were the missionary strategies of today. We are much more contextualized, and I think have a much better understanding of what is the gospel and what is Western culture. For starters, there's been a huge surge in the efforts to proclaim, not just to proclaim the good news, but to engage in good works. And so I mentioned this before. There's just as you see missions, the number of schools, the number of hospitals, the care for orphans. It's not a mistake that when you're in India or when you're in Africa and you look at who started these schools, who started the hospitals, what the names of the hospitals are, they're all often the names of Christians, because they were started by Christ followers who are trying to not simply bring the good news about God's love through His Son, but also to bring clean drinking water and an understanding of mathematics and chemistry and caring for people, no matter who they are and no matter what their interest in spiritual things might be. So, additionally, missionaries are now very trained in contextualization, taught to reflect on their own context as well as the cultural background of the people into which they are bringing the gospel. So we don't, nobody is making anyone dress like Westerners today, although globalization has basically been Westernization, and much of the world dresses like they are a teenager from the West. But most missionaries are now trying to find ways to contextualize what they're doing, and they're not bringing Western songs and any of that kind of thing. So, again, mistakes have been made. We need to own them. William Carey, for instance, some people will attack William Carey and say he worked on this plantation, and during that time they paid very low wages to the native, the indigenous Indian population there, and he had some sort of monopoly on trade back to Europe. Yes, I think those things were likely true. They say his role as a professor at this college started by India, not Serampore College that he started, but the college started, Fort Williams College, that they were training the East Indians to be good workers in the western cogs of the empire. The college existed, quote, to train civil servants. And yes, absolutely, I'm sure that is true. And we now look back at that and say, well, there's perhaps some issues there. But look, this is one of the inflection points, and this will become a bigger issue as we move through the 20th century. There are people who would say that it is wrong for missionaries to introduce modern medicine. It's wrong for missionaries to introduce reading and literacy. It's wrong for them to work to lower the infant mortality rates. So you're going to have to come to a point where you are asking yourself this question: is it possible that some cultures are better at some things than other cultures? Today, to say as much is to get into a lot of trouble. But I think that there were a lot of things in which the introduction of aspects of the West, Western medicine, Western healthcare, Western educational models, the care of orphans and widows, these things that are being driven by Christians or to some extent by people from the West, that these were good things. So I think that Carey did a lot of really good things. He helped found a college. He fought against the caste system. He fought against the practice of Indian widows being burned on the funeral pyre of their deceased husband. He fought against stoning rape victims because they were guilty of adultery, right? So you're going to have to say whether or not you go, yes, those are good things. They're different than the culture into which the missionaries were headed. So let me pivot here. This has been a longer podcast than normal. Are we done with the mission of the church? Right? Do we still need missionaries? we're gonna trace this when we jump ahead to when we get to the 21st century. But I want to say that in 1974, when they said we got to take the gospel to all people groups, that they identified, I think, 25,000 people groups, or they now say there's something like 25,000 people groups, and that there are, 10,000 people groups of a certain size, 500 or bigger, that have a language, and they don't have the Bible, they haven't heard the gospel in their own language. And so there remains work to be done. There certainly remains work to be done to see the church in all of its fullness expand. Certainly even in the West. We have a different missionary enterprise today. C.S. Lewis said you court a widow differently than you court a virgin. There's a sense in which the West is now sort of cycled through Christianity, and we're becoming a post-Christian culture. So there's work to be done here. But the work of missions is fascinating. The history of missions takes a big pivot in the 18th century under the leadership and the strategy of William Carey. Next up in the next podcast, we're going to look at the Irish philosopher and statesman Edmund Burke. He is an economist. He is a proponent of conservatism, and that's going to become a particular big issue, sort of the political economic aspects of this, as we're going to move through the 19th century, 20th century, Cold War, see big divisions between Marxism and sort of Western liberalism, and all of those terms need to be defined. We will be picking that up in the next podcast. See you then.